Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. I need to warn you about something. Right now, as you're watching this, there are places in the Appalachian Mountains where people just vanish, where your equipment stops working for no reason, where things in the shadows are learning how to act like us. I found 8 stories from people who barely made it out alive: a trucker, a nurse, a park ranger. Normal people doing normal jobs, until they weren't. What they saw in those mountains, it's been there for decades, maybe longer, watching, studying, waiting for the next person to wander too far. Quick, hit subscribe before we go deeper. Drop a like if your heart's already racing. Comment where you're from. Ready? There's no turning back now. I was 26 when I got the call that would change everything I thought I knew about the mountains I grew up in. My name's Tommy Jackson, and I've been working electrical maintenance for Appalachian Power since I got out of high school. It's honest work, pays the bills, and keeps me outdoors instead of trapped behind some desk counting down to 5 o'clock. Most days I'm replacing blown fuses or clearing tree branches off lines. Nothing that would make for much of a story. But that October, Hurricane Delilah had torn through eastern Kentucky like nothing anyone had seen in decades. The storm knocked out power to about 200 families scattered across maybe 100 square miles of the deepest mountain country you can imagine. We're talking about places where families have lived on the same land since before Kentucky was even a state. Folk who measure distance by creek beds and holler names that don't appear on any map the state keeps. My supervisor, Dale Morrison, had been trying to get volunteers for the restoration project for 3 days without much luck. The territory was remote enough that it meant camping out there for at least a week, maybe longer depending on what we found. Most of the younger guys had families they didn't want to leave, and the older hands knew better than to venture that far back into country they didn't know. But I'd grown up in these mountains, spent summers with my grandfather who'd worked timber in some of those same hollers back in the 50s, so I figured I knew what I was getting into. Dale handed me a manila folder thick with work orders, though calling them addresses was being generous. Most were descriptions like blue house past the abandoned mine, or farm where the road forks near Coon Creek. The kind of directions that make perfect sense if you've lived there your whole life but might as well be written in code for anyone else. He also gave me a company satellite phone, which should have been my first clue that cell towers weren't going to be much help out there. I loaded my truck with extra cable, transformers, climbing gear, and enough canned food and water for 2 weeks, just in case. The drive took 3 hours just to reach what passed for a main road in that part of the county, then another hour and a half on increasingly narrow dirt tracks that wound deeper into mountains that seemed to swallow up the sky. The further I went, the more the trees pressed in on both sides, creating a canopy so thick that noon felt like twilight. The first few stops went exactly like you'd expect. Fallen trees across power lines, damaged transformers where lightning had struck, straightforward repairs that took a few hours each. The families were grateful but kept to themselves, offering coffee and directions to the next house, but not much conversation. That's mountain courtesy for you. They appreciate the help, but don't see any need for small talk with strangers. It was late afternoon on the second day when I reached the cluster of houses where things started going wrong, though I couldn't have put my finger on what was bothering me at first. The area felt different somehow, like the air pressure had changed or a storm was coming, except the sky was clear. Even the sound of my truck engine seemed muffled, like I was driving through cotton. The silence was the first thing I really noticed. Not just quiet. These mountains are naturally peaceful, but a complete absence of sound that felt unnatural. No bird calls, no insects humming, no wind moving through the trees. Even my own breathing seemed too loud, like I was in a library or a funeral home where every sound carries further than it should. The first house was a small white farmhouse with a wraparound porch, and there was an elderly man sitting in a rocking chair who waved when he saw my truck. Normal enough, the kind of polite greeting you'd expect from mountain folk. I waved back and started unloading my gear, planning to check in with him once I figured out what was wrong with his power. The problem was obvious. A massive oak had come down across the lines about 50 yards from his house, probably during the storm. I spent the better part of 2 hours cutting it up and restringing the cable, hot work that had me taking regular water breaks. Every time I looked toward the house, the old man was still there in his chair, still giving me that same slow, friendly wave. After I got his power restored, I walked up to let him know everything was working again. He smiled and waved, just like before, but when I said, "Good afternoon, sir," he just kept waving. Same motion, same expression, like he hadn't heard me at all. "Everything's back up and running," I tried again, speaking a little louder in case he was hard of hearing. Same wave, same smile. And that's when I noticed his eyes. They were completely black, not dark brown or deeply shadowed, but solid black like someone had painted over them with ink. No whites visible, no pupils, just empty black that seemed to go on forever. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" I asked, stepping closer. He kept waving, and I realized something that made my stomach drop. His chest wasn't moving. I watched for maybe 30 seconds, counting in my head, and he never took a single breath, just sitting there perfectly still except for that rhythmic wave, like a mechanical toy that someone had wound up and forgotten about. I reached out and touched his wrist, thinking maybe he'd had a heart attack and needed medical attention. His skin was warm, felt completely normal, but there was no pulse. Nothing. Just warm flesh that moved naturally when I lifted his arm, but no life underneath it. That's when he turned his head to look directly at me, still smiling, still waving, and spoke in a voice that sounded like autumn leaves being crushed underfoot. "Power's working fine now," he said, and I felt every hair on my arms stand up, because those were the exact words I'd used when I first approached the house. Not just similar words, the exact same phrase, in the exact same tone of voice, like he'd been recording me and playing it back. I backed away slowly, and he continued that mechanical wave until I was back in my truck. Even as I drove to the next house, I could see him in my rearview mirror, still waving from that porch like nothing had happened. The next place was about a mile down a dirt track that barely qualified as a road, a small cabin with a woman hanging laundry on a line in the backyard. She waved when she saw me, and I waved back, but as I worked on restoring power to her house, I started noticing details that didn't add up. The clothes she was hanging were bone dry, looked like they'd been sitting in that basket for days, but she kept taking pieces out and pinning them to the line in the exact same sequence. White sheet, 2 pillowcases, blue work shirt, pair of jeans. Then she'd unpin them all, put them back in the basket, and start over. White sheet, 2 pillowcases, blue work shirt, pair of jeans. Never any variation, never any pause, just the same routine repeated endlessly. When I finished with her power line and walked over to talk to her, she turned toward me with that same slow wave I'd seen from the old man. Same black eyes, same empty smile. But when she spoke, it was in my own voice again. "Everything's back up and running," she said, using the same words I'd spoken to the old man an hour earlier. The third house had a man in the yard splitting wood that was already split, stacking pieces that were already stacked, then moving them back to split again. When he saw me, he waved and said, "Good afternoon, sir," in my voice from earlier that day. The fourth house had children playing in the yard, but they were going through the motions of games without any of the equipment, throwing a ball that wasn't there, running to bases that didn't exist, taking turns at something that made no sense. When they noticed me, they all waved in perfect unison and said, "Sir, are you feeling all right?" in the same voice I'd used with the old man. By then, I was starting to understand what was happening, and it was so much worse than I'd initially thought. These things, because I couldn't think of them as people anymore, weren't just copying human behavior. They were copying me specifically, learning from my words and actions and somehow storing them for later use. Every interaction I had was being recorded, analyzed, and added to their repertoire. I decided I needed to see inside one of these houses to understand what I was really dealing with. The family at the fourth house was all outside doing their repetitive activities, so I tried the front door. It was unlocked, which wasn't unusual for mountain folk, but when I stepped inside, I immediately knew something was terribly wrong. The living room looked normal at first glance. Furniture arranged properly, family photos on the mantelpiece, TV playing in the corner. But the details were all wrong, like someone had studied pictures of human homes but didn't understand what any of it meant. The TV was showing nothing but static, turned up just loud enough to be annoying. The family photos had all the faces scratched out with something sharp. The furniture was arranged with mathematical precision, every piece exactly the same distance from the walls. In the kitchen, I found dishes stacked in the cabinets with obsessive organization, plates sorted by size down to the millimeter, glasses arranged by height, silverware separated not just by type, but by subtle variations in design. The refrigerator was humming, but completely empty except for a carton of milk that had expired 4 months ago. Upstairs, the bedrooms were even more unsettling. Beds made with hospital corners so tight you could bounce a quarter off them. Clothes hung in closets organized by color gradation like a paint sample chart. But no personal touches, no random clutter, no evidence that real people had ever actually lived in these spaces. That's when I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. I froze, listening, because I could see the family members outside still going through their repetitive motions. The footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom I was in, and I heard the doorknob turn slowly. A man walked in, had to be the father of the family, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap. But his movement was wrong, too stiff and jerky, like someone learning to walk for the first time. When he turned to look at me, those black eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He smiled and opened his mouth, and what came out was every word I'd spoken since arriving in this area, but all jumbled together in a rapid stream that made no sense. My voice talking about power lines mixed with my voice asking if people were all right, mixed with my voice saying good afternoon, all running together like a broken radio stuck between stations. Behind him, I heard more footsteps and realized the rest of the family had abandoned their outside activities and were coming into the house. Not just this family. I could hear voices outside that meant people from the other houses were converging on this location too. I pushed past the father, who stepped aside without resistance, and made it to the stairs just as the mother reached the bottom, moving with that same puppet-like gait. She opened her mouth and my voice came out, but the words were wrong, rearranged into new patterns that sounded almost like language but meant nothing. More of them were filing through the front door, people from every house I'd visited that day, all moving in perfect synchronization, all speaking in fragments of my own voice. They weren't trying to stop me, just watching, studying my movements with those empty black eyes like they were learning something new about human behavior. I made it to my truck and locked the doors, but they surrounded the vehicle, pressing their faces against the windows. One of them, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 8, put her palm flat against my windshield and smiled. When she opened her mouth, rows of needle-sharp teeth were visible behind her lips, definitely not human, more like a lamprey or some deep-sea predator. But it was what she said that made me understand the true horror of what I was dealing with. She spoke in my voice, but the words were ones I hadn't said yet, words I was only thinking. "I need to get out of here," she said, perfectly mimicking not just my voice but my exact thoughts in that moment. They could read my mind. They weren't just copying my speech and actions. They were somehow accessing my thoughts, my intentions, maybe even my memories. I realized that everything I knew, everything I was being absorbed and cataloged by whatever these things really were. The engine started on the first try, and I threw it in reverse. The crowd of hollow people moved aside as I backed up, but instead of dispersing, they followed my truck down the road, matching my speed exactly, their movements becoming more coordinated the longer they observed me. I drove faster, but they kept pace, their jerky puppet movements becoming smoother, more human-like. They were learning to run by watching me drive, somehow understanding the connection between my urgency and my actions. By the time I reached the main road, they were moving almost normally, like real people, instead of broken marionettes. I didn't stop until I was back in town, and even then, I sat in my truck outside the power company office for an hour, trying to process what I'd experienced. When I finally went inside to report to Dale, I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. How do you explain that there are things living in the deepest mountains that can steal not just your voice but your thoughts, that learn to be human by consuming everything that makes you yourself? I told him the area was too dangerous for a single worker, that there were structural damage issues that would require a full crew. He marked those houses as permanently offline and never questioned my recommendation. The company wrote it off as storm damage in an economically unviable service area, but I couldn't write it off so easily. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things that made me question whether I'd really escaped at all. Sometimes I'd catch myself saying things I didn't remember thinking, using phrases that felt foreign in my mouth. I'd find myself moving in ways that felt mechanical, repetitive, like I was going through the motions of being human without understanding why. The worst part was the dreams. Night after night, I'd see those black eyes staring back at me, and I'd hear my own voice speaking words I'd never said, making promises I'd never made, telling stories about a life that wasn't quite mine. In the dreams, I was back in those mountains, but I was on the other side now, standing on porches and waving at strangers, repeating their words back to them in voices that weren't quite right. I started avoiding mirrors because sometimes the reflection didn't look like me. Same face, same body, but something was different in the eyes, something empty and hungry that reminded me of those things in the mountains. I'd blink and it would be gone, but the feeling would linger for hours afterward. 6 months later, I transferred to a different district, moved to a city 3 hours away where the mountains were just a blue line on the horizon. I told myself it was for better opportunities, better pay, but the truth was I needed to be somewhere with lots of people, lots of noise, lots of life. Somewhere those things couldn't follow without being noticed. But sometimes, late at night, when the city is finally quiet, I hear footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. Slow, deliberate footsteps that stop right outside my door. And sometimes I hear my own voice, muffled through the wall. speaking to someone I can't see, using words I said months ago in mountains I've tried to forget. I never answer the door when that happens. I just lie in bed and wait for morning, counting my heartbeats to make sure I'm still alive, still breathing, still me. Because I know what's waiting out there in the hallway, and I know that one day the footsteps won't stop at my door. They'll have learned enough by then. They'll know how to be me better than I do. The mountains keep their secrets, but sometimes the secrets don't stay in the mountains. Sometimes they follow you home, learning a little more about being human every day, getting closer to perfect with each stolen breath, each borrowed heartbeat. And the worst part? I'm starting to think they might be right. Maybe being human isn't about having a soul or consciousness or free will. Maybe it's just about going through the right motions, saying the right words, breathing at the right intervals. Maybe the only difference between me and them is that I still remember what I used to be. For now. I'm 39 years old, and I've been guiding hunting trips in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia for about 15 years now. Started when I got out of the Army and needed something that would keep me outdoors. Couldn't handle being cooped up in an office after what I'd seen overseas. The mountains felt safe, predictable. I knew every deer trail, every bear den, every water source across about 50,000 acres of wilderness. Or at least, I thought I did. My business isn't anything fancy, just me, my truck, and a lifetime of knowing these woods better than most people know their own backyards. I take city folks out who want to bag a trophy buck, maybe get some pictures for their office walls. Usually it's pretty straightforward work. Set up camp, track some deer, help them get a clean shot, pack everything out. Simple. That changed 3 years ago when I got hired by these 3 guys from Richmond. They'd found my number through some hunting forum online, said they wanted to go deep into the wilderness, get away from all the other hunters crowding the state parks. They were willing to pay double my usual rate if I could take them somewhere really remote, somewhere they could get a genuine backcountry experience. The money was good, better than I'd seen in months, so I agreed to take them to Crow's Nest Ridge. It's about 20 miles from the nearest logging road, accessible only by foot or ATV if you know the right trails. I'd been using a particular valley up there for years as a base camp. Perfect hunting spot, with a natural clearing near a spring and plenty of game trails converging nearby. The deer moved through there like clockwork during migration season. These guys seemed normal enough when they showed up at my place that first morning. Mike was the leader of their group, some kind of investment banker who'd been hunting since he was a kid but never in terrain like this. Then there was David, a doctor who'd only started hunting a few years back but was serious about it, had all the expensive gear. And finally Carlos, Mike's brother-in-law, who mostly just wanted to get some time away from his wife and kids. They had decent equipment, weren't completely green, and they listened when I explained the safety protocols. The hike in took most of the day. We were carrying enough supplies for 4 days: food, water, camping gear, plus all their hunting equipment. The trail up to Crow's Nest Ridge isn't exactly a walk in the park. It switchbacks through thick forest, crosses 3 different creek beds, and climbs about 2,800 feet in elevation. But these guys were in decent shape, and we made good time. I remember feeling good about the trip as we set up camp that first afternoon. The weather was perfect, clear skies, temperature in the low 40s, no wind to speak of. The kind of conditions that make deer move predictably. We had the camp set up before sunset, and I walked the guys through the area, showing them where the main game trails were, explaining how the deer typically moved through the valley in the early morning and late evening. That night around the campfire, We talked about their strategy for the next few days. Mike wanted to try for a big buck he'd heard rumors about. Some local hunters called it Old Moses, said it had a rack that spread wider than most men could reach. David just wanted to get his first deer with a bow. Carlos wasn't picky, just wanted to enjoy being out in nature. Standard stuff. We turned in around 10 o'clock, planning to be up before dawn. But the first morning, when I went to check the trails before waking the guys up, something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it exactly, but the deer paths I'd known for years weren't where they should be. Or rather, they were there, but they led in completely different directions than I remembered. Now I know what you're thinking. Maybe I was just disoriented, got turned around in the dark. But I've been walking these mountains for 15 years. I know them like I know my own living room. The main trail that should have led north toward the ridgeline was now curving east toward a section of forest I'd always avoided because it was too dense for deer to move through comfortably. When I followed this redirected trail, I found fresh deer tracks. Lots of them. But they were moving in perfect straight lines, like they were being driven somewhere specific. Wild deer don't move like that. They wander, they stop to forage, they zigzag following scent trails and food sources. These tracks showed animals walking in formation, almost like livestock being herded by a rancher. I spent about an hour following these unnatural trail patterns, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The tracks led to a clearing I'd never noticed before, even though it was only about half a mile from our camp. In this clearing, I found hundreds of hoof prints that converged in a perfect circle, maybe 30 feet across. But there were no deer there, no sign of what had gathered them in that spot. That's when I noticed the other tracks. Bipedal prints, roughly human-sized, but wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. The footprints had elongated toes, much longer than human feet should be, and they showed whatever was making them had been walking upright around the perimeter of the deer circle, like someone observing livestock in a pen. I stared at those tracks for probably 10 minutes, trying to come up with some logical explanation. Maybe it was another hunter wearing some kind of unusual boots. Maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs, though I'd never seen bear tracks that looked remotely like this. Maybe I was seeing things that weren't really there. But when I crouched down and examined the prints more closely, I could see the individual toe marks pressed deep into the soft earth. 5 toes on each foot, but stretched out like someone had taken human feet and pulled them through some kind of taffy machine. And the gait pattern showed that whatever made them was comfortable walking upright for long distances. I decided not to tell the guys about this when I got back to camp. They were excited about their first day of hunting, and I didn't want to spook them with something I couldn't explain. We had breakfast and headed out to our hunting positions just as the sun was coming up. The day went normally enough. David managed to get a decent shot at a 6-point buck around mid-morning, though he missed. Mike spent most of the day in a tree stand near what he thought was a promising game trail. Carlos just enjoyed walking around with his camera, taking pictures of the scenery. By evening, none of them had bagged anything, but they were in good spirits. It was the second day when things really started getting weird. We were hiking to a new area I wanted to try, and I noticed the guys were walking differently. Instead of spreading out the way they had the previous day, they were moving in single file, perfectly spaced about 6 feet apart. When I asked Mike about it, he looked confused. "What do you mean?" he said. "This feels right, doesn't it? More efficient this way." David and Carlos nodded in agreement, like walking in formation was the most natural thing in the world. But they'd been hiking spread out for 15 years of hunting trips. There was no reason for them to suddenly change their behavior, especially not in a way that made them more vulnerable to getting lost. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and focus on finding deer sign. But as the morning went on, I kept noticing other small changes in their behavior. They were all stopping to rest at exactly the same intervals, even though they had different fitness levels. When we reached a fork in the trail, they would all pause and look in the same direction, waiting for some kind of signal I couldn't detect. Around noon, we stopped for lunch near a stream. While the guys were eating their sandwiches, I walked upstream to refill our water bottles. That's when I heard the whistling. It started low and soft, almost musical, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. But it wasn't any bird call I recognized, and it had an artificial quality to it, like someone trying to imitate a bird without quite getting it right. The sound would stop for a few seconds, then start again from a different location, as if whatever was making it was moving through the trees. When I got back to the lunch spot, all three guys were sitting perfectly still, facing the direction the whistling was coming from. They weren't eating, weren't talking, just staring into the woods with blank expressions on their faces. "Guys," I said, "everything okay?" They all turned to look at me at exactly the same time, blinking like they were waking up from a daydream. "Sorry," Mike said, shaking his head. "Thought I heard something interesting. Ready to keep going?" The whistling had stopped as soon as I spoke. For the rest of the afternoon, I kept glancing back at the guys, watching for any more strange behavior. They seemed normal enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the forest, studying how we moved and interacted. That night, I barely slept. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something large moving around our campsite in what sounded like a perfect circle. The footsteps were heavy but precise, maintaining exactly the same distance from our tents as they traced the perimeter. I counted the steps. It took exactly 127 paces to complete one circuit, and whatever was out there made the same circle 4 times before disappearing back into the forest. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent to take a look, but there was nothing visible in the darkness beyond our camp. The guys were all still asleep, or at least they weren't making any noise. But when I shined the light on the ground the next morning, I could see the tracks clearly pressed into the dirt around our camp, the same elongated footprints I'd found at the deer gathering place. Only now they were forming a boundary line around our sleeping area. The third morning, I woke up to find all 3 guys standing at the edge of camp, facing into the forest. They were perfectly aligned, about 3 feet apart, and they'd been standing there long enough for dew to collect on their hair and clothes. When I called out to them, they turned around looking confused, like they had no memory of leaving their tents. "I was having the strangest dream," David said, rubbing his eyes. "Felt so real, like something was calling to me." Mike and Carlos nodded in agreement. They all described the same dream, a voice in the forest that felt familiar and comforting, inviting them to follow it deeper into the mountains. They couldn't remember actually getting up and walking outside, but they'd all had the overwhelming urge to head north toward the ridgeline. That's when I knew we had a serious problem. Whatever was out there had been testing different species. First the deer, now us. It was learning how to control movement patterns, studying how to herd living creatures like a rancher managing livestock. And it was getting better at it. I made the decision to pack up and head out that morning, even though we'd planned to stay another day. I told the guys there was weather moving in, and I wanted to get them off the mountain before it hit. They grumbled a bit, but agreed to break camp. But when we tried to retrace our route back to the trailhead, the paths were wrong. The trail we'd used to hike in was nowhere to be found. Instead, there were new paths that led deeper into the mountains, winding up toward areas I'd never explored. My compass was spinning wildly, and my GPS was showing terrain features that didn't match what I could see with my eyes. We spent 6 hours trying to navigate out of that valley, but every trail we followed led us in a wide circle back to the clearing where I'd found the deer tracks. It was like being trapped in a maze that kept rearranging itself. The guys were getting frustrated and tired, but they still seemed strangely calm about our situation, like being lost was part of some natural process they didn't need to question. On our third pass through the clearing, I saw it. The thing was standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 yards away, watching us with the patient stillness of a predator studying prey. It was roughly 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, and its fingers were long and thin like tree branches. But what really got to me was its head. Too large for its body, with eyes that caught the afternoon sunlight and reflected it back like mirrors. The creature tilted its head to one side, studying our group with the kind of clinical interest a scientist might show when observing lab animals. Then it made that same low whistling sound I'd heard by the stream, and all 3 guys immediately started walking toward it. I watched in horror as Mike, David, and Carlos moved in perfect formation across the clearing, their faces blank and peaceful, like they were following the most natural instinct in the world. The thing was herding them just like it had herded the deer, using some kind of signal I couldn't hear or feel, but that apparently worked on human brains just as effectively as animal ones. I fired my rifle into the air. The sharp crack of the gunshot seemed to break whatever spell the creature had cast over the guys. They stopped walking and looked around in confusion, like they'd just woken up in an unfamiliar place. The thing let out a shriek that sounded like metal scraping against metal, and then it melted back into the forest with an impossible fluidity, like it was made of shadow rather than flesh and bone. "What the hell was that?" Mike said, looking back and forth between me and the spot where the creature had been standing. I didn't try to explain. Instead, I told them we needed to move immediately, that there were dangerous animals in the area, and we had to find our way out before dark. The mention of danger seemed to snap them out of their strange complacency, and for the first time in 2 days, they started acting like themselves again, alert, concerned, ready to follow my lead without question. We found a game trail that actually led down the mountain instead of in circles, and I pushed them to move as fast as they could manage with full packs. Every time they started to slow down or suggested taking a break, I could see that blank, peaceful expression starting to creep back into their eyes, like they were receiving signals telling them to relax and follow some invisible guide. I kept them moving for 12 straight hours, only stopping for water and quick snacks. We didn't reach my truck until well after midnight, but I wasn't taking any chances with whatever was manipulating their behavior. The closer we got to civilization, the more normal they seemed to become, like the creature's influence had a limited range. The drive back to town was quiet. The guys dozed in the passenger seats, exhausted from the forced march, but unable to remember exactly why I'd been in such a hurry to leave. When I asked them what they remembered about our last day on the mountain, they had fragments, the strange dreams, the feeling of being called toward something, brief flashes of walking through the forest, but no clear recollection of being controlled by something outside their own consciousness. I never took clients back to Crow's Nest Ridge. When people ask about that area specifically, I tell them the terrain is too dangerous for guided trips. Unstable rock, unpredictable weather, poor visibility. It's not exactly a lie. Sometimes when I'm guiding hunts in other parts of the mountains, I see deer moving in those same unnatural formations, perfect lines, coordinated movement patterns that look more like military drills than wild animal behavior. When that happens, I change our hunting location immediately, and I watch my clients carefully for any signs that they're starting to fall under the same kind of influence. To this day, I can't explain what that thing was or how it managed to control living creatures like livestock. All I know is that there's something in those mountains that sees humans and animals as resources to be managed rather than independent beings with free will. It's patient, it's intelligent, and it's still up there, practicing its herding techniques on anything that wanders into its territory. I still guide hunting trips, but I stick to areas closer to civilization now. The money isn't as good, and the hunting isn't as challenging, but I sleep better at night knowing that my clients will go home with their memories and their autonomy intact. Some experiences change you in ways you can't come back from, and I've learned to respect the boundaries that separate the world we understand from the one that understands us far better than we'd like to think. I was 29 when I took the contract at Whispering Pines Medical Center, working as a traveling nurse through one of those agencies that sends you to places nobody else wants to go. I'd been doing it for about 3 years by then, moving from one understaffed clinic to another, mostly in rural areas where they were desperate enough to pay premium rates for temporary help. The work was good money, and honestly, I liked the isolation. After my divorce, I wasn't in any hurry to put down roots somewhere. The agency called it a challenging placement, which usually meant either the location was terrible or the staff was impossible to work with. Whispering Pines was deep in the North Carolina mountains, about 40 miles from the nearest real town, serving scattered communities tucked into hollows and ridges that most people didn't even know existed. The drive up there took me through winding roads that got narrower and more broken the further I went, past rusted mailboxes and gravel driveways disappearing into thick woods. My GPS lost signal twice before I finally saw the weathered sign for the medical center. The facility itself wasn't much to look at. A low brick building that looked like it had been built in the 70s and hadn't seen much maintenance since. There were maybe a dozen parking spaces, half of them cracked concrete with weeds growing through. The mountains pressed in close on all sides, covered in dense forest that seemed to swallow sound. It was the kind of quiet that made your ears ring, if that makes sense. No traffic noise, no machinery, just the occasional bird call echoing off the ridges. Dr. Patricia Holbrook ran the place, a woman in her 60s who'd been there since the clinic opened. She had that weathered look mountain people get, like she'd been carved out of the landscape itself. During my interview over the phone, she'd been straightforward about the challenges: limited resources, difficult access, patients who sometimes traveled hours for basic care. What she didn't mention was how strange some of those patients would turn out to be. My first week was exactly what I expected from rural medicine. Diabetes management for elderly folks who'd lived on fried food and sweet tea their whole lives. Minor injuries from farm work and hunting accidents. A lot of hypertension and arthritis. Basic stuff, really, just in a location most nurses wouldn't want to deal with. The patients were polite in that formal mountain way, calling me ma'am, and asking about my family, even though I was clearly an outsider. I was staying in a small apartment above the town's only grocery store, about 15 minutes down the mountain from the clinic. The store owner, Mrs. Chen, had moved up from Charlotte years ago and seemed grateful for the company of another transplant. She warned me about the mountain roads at night and made sure I had her phone number in case of emergencies. The apartment was basic but clean, with a view of forested ridges that went on for miles. It was during my third week that I started noticing something off about certain patients. At first, it was just little things that didn't quite add up. medical anomalies that made me double-check my equipment. The first one was Harold Pritchard, an elderly man who came in for a routine checkup. He was polite, answered all my questions normally, but when I took his vital signs, the numbers made no sense. His core temperature registered 89.3 degrees on 3 different thermometers. That should have put him in severe hypothermia, unconscious at minimum, probably dead. Instead, he sat there chatting about the weather like nothing was wrong. I thought my thermometers were malfunctioning, so I tried the manual blood pressure cuff instead of the digital one. No detectable pulse. I moved the stethoscope around his chest, pressing harder, thinking I was missing it somehow. Nothing. But Harold kept talking, breathing normally, even laughed at something I said about the mountain roads. "Mr. Pritchard," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I'm having some trouble getting accurate readings. Do you mind if I try again?" He just smiled and nodded, rolling up his sleeve again. "These old machines get confused sometimes," he said. "Mountain air plays tricks on them." The second attempt gave me the same impossible results. Temperature below 90, no detectable heartbeat, blood pressure so low it barely registered on the gauge. I made notes in his chart and decided to mention it to Dr. Holbrook later. Maybe there was some medical condition I wasn't familiar with, something genetic to the area. But then came Emma Thorne, a woman in her 30s who walked in for birth control consultation. Same thing. Temperature in the high 80s, no pulse I could find, blood pressure readings that should have indicated severe shock. She was alert, conversational, even drove herself to the appointment. Her skin felt cold when I touched her arm, like she'd been standing outside in winter, but it was a warm September day. When I drew blood for routine labs, she didn't flinch when the needle went in. Most people at least tense up a little, but Emma just watched with mild curiosity, like she was observing someone else's procedure. The blood itself looked normal, maybe a little darker than usual, but that could have been the lighting. "Emma," I said, "do you ever feel cold? Like unusually cold?" She tilted her head, considering. "Cold doesn't really bother me much," she said. "My family's always been that way. Mountain hardy, my grandmother used to call it." Over the next few days, more patients came in with the same impossible vital signs, all from the same general area, the deep hollows north of the clinic, accessible only by rough logging roads and footpaths. They moved differently too, now that I was paying attention. Too smoothly, like they were floating slightly above the ground instead of walking normally. Their steps didn't make quite the right sound on the linoleum floors. I started documenting everything, thinking maybe I'd stumbled onto some unknown genetic condition. Temperature regulation disorder, maybe, or some cardiovascular anomaly that let them function with barely detectable vital signs. I'd heard of stranger things in isolated populations, but the more I watched them, the more wrong they seemed. They never blinked often enough. I timed it once, and Harold went almost 3 minutes without blinking while we talked. Their pupils didn't react to my pen light the way they should, staying the same size regardless of light changes. When they spoke, sometimes I caught what sounded like other voices underneath, like an echo or overlay. Dr. Holbrook brushed off my concerns when I finally brought them to her. She was filling out paperwork at her desk, not making eye contact while I explained the impossible vital signs and strange behaviors. "Mountain folk are different," she said without looking up. "Don't worry about the numbers so much. As long as they're functional, that's what matters." "But Dr. Holbrook, these readings suggest they should be dead." She finally looked at me then, and something in her expression made me step back. "They're not dead though, are they? They're walking and talking just fine. Maybe your equipment needs calibrating. I had my equipment checked the next day. Everything was working perfectly. That night, I started researching the area's history on my laptop. Most of the online records were sparse, but I found references to a mining disaster in 1952. A methane gas leak in the old Harwick mine had killed 23 workers, and the tunnels had collapsed before rescue teams could recover the bodies. The mine was in the exact area where my strange patients lived. I dug deeper, cross-referencing family names from the disaster records with the names on my patient charts. Every single one of my anomalous patients had surnames that matched the dead miners. Pritchard, Thorne, Caswell, Meadows, all families who'd lost fathers and sons in that collapse 70 years ago. The coincidence felt too big to ignore, but I wasn't sure what it meant. Generational trauma, some kind of environmental contamination from the old mine affecting the descendants. I was grasping for rational explanations because the alternative, the thing I didn't want to think about, was impossible. During my 4th week, I started paying closer attention to my patients' behavior patterns. The strange ones always arrived in small groups, never alone. They moved in perfect coordination, like they were following some invisible choreographer. When one turned their head, the others would turn the same direction at the same moment. They showed no reaction to pain, blood draws, injections, even when I accidentally stuck Emma's finger with the glucose meter harder than intended. Nothing. No flinch, no sharp intake of breath, just that same mild curiosity. Their eyes followed movement with predator-like precision, tracking every gesture I made with uncomfortable intensity. But they never seemed to actually see me as a person, more like they were studying a specimen, taking notes on how humans were supposed to behave. I started feeling watched during my shifts, not just by my patients, but from outside too. Multiple sets of eyes that I could never quite locate. The feeling was strongest in the afternoon, when the mountains cast long shadows across the parking lot. I'd look up from my charts and catch glimpses of pale figures standing just inside the tree line, perfectly still. One evening, I stayed late to finish paperwork and saw them gathered outside the clinic, 7 or 8 people standing in a loose circle in the parking lot. They weren't talking or moving, just standing there in absolute silence. I watched from the window as they slowly turned toward the building in perfect unison, all facing the same spot where I stood. When I stepped away from the window and looked back a few seconds later, they were gone. That's when I started noticing signs that someone had been in my apartment. Nothing dramatic, no broken locks or obvious intrusion. Just small things moved slightly. My coffee mug turned a different direction on the counter. Books on the shelf rearranged in a subtly different order. The remote control moved from the coffee table to the arm of the couch. At first, I thought Mrs. Chen might have come up to check something, but she would have mentioned it. And the changes were too careful, too purposeful. Someone was examining my belongings, learning about how I lived. I started finding muddy footprints on my apartment's front steps that didn't match any shoes I owned. The prints had an odd shape, too wide, with what looked like extra toes, and the heel impression was wrong somehow. Too deep and pointed, like whatever made them had a different bone structure in their feet. The footprints appeared after rain, always fresh but with no trail leading to or from them, as if whatever left them had materialized on my doorstep and vanished again. I bought a small security camera and set it up pointing at my front door, thinking I'd finally get proof of who was messing with me. The first night's footage showed nothing unusual until around 2 a.m. when the image started to distort. Static patterns filled the screen, and when it cleared, there were people standing in my apartment. 3 of them: Harold, Emma, and a third patient I recognized but couldn't place. They moved through my living space like they owned it, touching my belongings with careful precision. Harold picked up framed photos from my bookshelf, studying them with that same predator-like focus. Emma opened my refrigerator and actually smelled the food inside, like she was trying to understand what it was for. The third one, a middle-aged woman whose name escaped me, went through my laundry basket, holding pieces of clothing up to her face, not just smelling them, but tasting the fabric with her tongue. They spent almost an hour in my apartment, examining everything, moving with that same too-smooth coordination. When they were done, they simply walked toward the door and seemed to melt through it, their bodies becoming translucent and flowing like mist. The next morning, I checked the door. Still locked, no signs of forced entry. But my things had been rearranged again, more extensively this time. Someone had gone through my closet, my bathroom cabinets, even my computer bag. I called the agency that placed me and told them I had a family emergency, that I needed to end my contract early. Dr. Holbrook barely seemed surprised when I gave my notice. She just nodded and said she'd handle the paperwork. Packing took me about an hour. I threw everything into my car and started the drive down the mountain without looking back. It wasn't until I was 20 miles away that my GPS signal returned and my phone started getting bars again. Like the whole area existed in some kind of dead zone. I thought leaving would be the end of it, but I was wrong. My next contract was in Tennessee, a small clinic outside Knoxville. Different mountains, different people, normal medical work with patients whose vital signs made sense. I was starting to feel like I'd imagined the whole thing, or maybe I'd been having some kind of breakdown from stress and isolation. Then Harold Pritchard walked into my clinic. Same face, same voice, same polite manner. But this was impossible. I was 3 states away from Whispering Pines, and Harold had no way of knowing where I'd gone. My placement agency kept that information confidential. "Hello again, Nurse Martinez," he said, settling into the examination chair like he belonged there. "I seem to be having some circulation troubles." I checked the appointment book. He wasn't on the schedule. I asked the receptionist, but she insisted she'd never seen him before and had no record of him registering. His vital signs were the same impossible readings. No pulse, temperature in the 80s, blood pressure barely detectable. But this time I noticed something new. When he spoke, his voice had subtle differences. Inflections and word choices that matched my own speech patterns, like he'd been listening to me talk and practicing. "How did you find me here?" I asked. Harold tilted his head with that same predator-like precision. "I followed the scent," he said, then seemed to catch himself. I heard you were working nearby." 3 more patients from Whispering Pines showed up over the following week. Emma Thorne, the woman with the strange footprints, and 2 others whose names I recognized from my charts. All with the same impossible vital signs, all claiming to have moved to the area recently. They were copying me more accurately now. Marque, mannerisms, the way I moved my hands when I talked, even some of my verbal habits. I'd taught them how to be better at pretending to be human, and now they were using that education to follow me. I quit the Tennessee contract and drove to Georgia. Same thing happened within 2 weeks. Then Alabama, then Mississippi. Each time they found me. Each time they were better at mimicking normal human behavior, learning from every interaction. It wasn't until I moved to a large hospital in Atlanta that they finally stopped appearing. Something about the urban environment, maybe, or the sheer number of people. Whatever those things were, They seemed to prefer isolated areas where they could operate without too much scrutiny. I've been working in city hospitals ever since. Good pay, normal patients, no impossible vital signs or predator-like stares. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving home, I wonder about other traveling nurses working in remote areas. How many of them have encountered patients whose temperatures run too cold and whose hearts don't seem to beat? How many rural medical centers are staffed by things that learn to practice medicine by watching us work? I still have the security camera footage from my apartment, stored on a flash drive I keep in my jewelry box. Sometimes I watch it to remind myself that it really happened, that I didn't imagine the whole thing. 3 figures moving through my space like they owned it, learning how to be human by studying everything I touched. To this day, I won't take contracts in rural areas, cities only, where there are too many people and too much noise for anything to study you that closely. Where the mountains can't press in close enough to hide things that should have stayed buried in collapsed mine shafts 70 years ago. I don't talk about it much. Who would believe me? But sometimes I wonder about the families in those hollows north of Whispering Pines, the descendants of miners who died in 1952. I wonder if they know what's wearing their ancestors' faces walking around in bodies that never learned how to be properly alive. And I wonder what else is down in those old mine shafts, still learning, still copying, still trying to figure out how to replace us completely. I'm 34 years old, and I've been driving trucks for 12 years now. Started right out of high school when my dad got me connected with a buddy of his who ran a small freight company out of Charleston. Thought I knew every back road, every shortcut, every truck stop between here and anywhere else you could name in Appalachia. Hell, I used to brag about it. Said I could get a load anywhere in these mountains faster than any GPS could route it. That was before I learned there are roads in these hills that aren't on any map. Roads that shouldn't exist. Roads that hunt. The whole thing started 3 years ago when I was still doing independent contracts. Money was tight. My ex-wife had just cleaned me out in the divorce, and I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment above Manny's auto shop in Beckley, working every job I could get my hands on. When dispatch called me at 2 a.m. about a rush delivery to some general store way up in Bone Creek Hollow, West Virginia, I didn't ask questions. The pay was double my usual rate, and they needed 40 cases of canned goods and dry supplies delivered by morning. I'd never heard of Bone Creek Hollow, but that wasn't unusual. There are dozens of little settlements scattered through these mountains that barely qualify as towns. Just a handful of houses, maybe a church, sometimes a store that serves the families living miles back in the hollows. The GPS coordinates they gave me put it about 4 hours northeast of Beckley, up in some of the roughest country in the state. I loaded up my rig, a 2018 Freightliner Cascadia, pulling a 53-foot dry van, and headed out around 3 a.m. The first 3 hours went smooth as silk. I knew most of the route, taking US 19 north through Fayetteville, then picking up smaller state highways that wound deeper into coal country. The roads got narrower and the hills got steeper, but nothing I hadn't handled 1,000 times before. It was when I got within about 10 miles of the delivery point that everything went sideways. My GPS, a brand new Garmin that had never given me trouble, just went dead. Screen went black like someone had pulled the power cord. I tried restarting it, checking the connections, even smacking it a few times, but nothing. Just a blank screen. Now, I'm not the type to panic over a little technology failure. I've got paper maps in my cab, and I know how to read them. But when I pulled over to check my atlas, I couldn't find Bone Creek Hollow anywhere. Not on the state map, not on the county maps, nowhere. Like the place just didn't exist. That's when I remembered my old CB radio. I'd kept the thing mounted under my dash even though most drivers had switched to cell phones years ago. Sometimes the old ways are still the best ways, especially in country where cell towers are few and far between. I flipped it on and started scanning the channels. Breaker 1 to 9. This is Phantom Freight eastbound on Route 41, looking for directions to Bone Creek Hollow. Anyone out there know the area? Static crackled for a minute. Then a voice came through. Deep, gravelly, with that mountain accent you hear from drivers who've been working these roads since before the interstate system. Phantom Freight, this is Iron Mountain. You looking for the general store up there? That's a 10-4 Iron Mountain. GPS crapped out on me about 10 miles back. Yeah, that happens up in that country. Tell you what, you want to save yourself 3 hours of climbing switchbacks, there's a shortcut. Hunter's Road through Devil's Gap. Not on your fancy computer maps, but it'll get you there. I grabbed my pen. Go ahead with those directions. About 2 miles ahead, you'll see a busted-up billboard for some old motor lodge. Right past that, there's a turnoff to your left. Just a little paved road cutting into the trees. Take that and follow it straight through. Should put you right where you need to be. Appreciated, Iron Mountain. Any particular reason it's called the Hunter's Road? There was a long pause. When he came back on, his voice was different, harder. Just keep moving, Phantom Freight. No matter what you see, no matter what happens, just keep that rig moving. Don't stop for nothing. You understand? 10-4, I guess. Thanks for the help. Good luck, driver. The radio went quiet after that. I tried raising Iron Mountain again, but got nothing but static. Still, I figured directions were directions, and if there was a shortcut that could save me 3 hours, I'd be stupid not to take it. I found the turnoff exactly where he said it would be. The billboard was there, so faded and weather-beaten you couldn't make out what it used to advertise, just rusted metal and peeling paint. And right past it, almost hidden by overgrown brush, was a narrow strip of asphalt cutting into the forest. What struck me as odd was how perfect the road surface looked. This was supposed to be some old logging road or hunting trail, but the asphalt was smooth as glass, black as midnight, and not a crack or pothole in sight, like it had been paved yesterday, even though moss and vines were growing right up to the edges. I downshifted and eased my rig onto the road. The trees closed in overhead almost immediately, forming a tunnel of branches and leaves that blocked out most of the sky. My headlights cut through the darkness ahead, illuminating maybe 50 yards of that perfect black asphalt before it curved out of sight. For the first few miles, everything seemed normal. Just a narrow road through thick forest, the kind of shortcut that local drivers know about but never makes it onto official maps. My truck was running smooth, the load was stable, and I was making good time. Then, about 5 miles in, I started noticing that my rig was handling differently. Nothing dramatic at first, just a slight pull to one side, like I had a tire losing pressure or the road had a bad crown. I checked my gauges and everything looked normal. Air pressure was good, engine temperature was fine, oil pressure steady, but the pulling got worse. My steering wheel started jerking in my hands like something was trying to drag the truck toward the tree line. I had to fight to keep it centered on the road, muscles straining against whatever force was trying to pull me off course. That's when I first saw them. At first, I thought it was just trees, pale birch trunks standing between the darker pines and oaks. But as my headlights swept across the forest, I realized the pale shapes were wrong. Too tall, too thin, and they were standing upright in places where no trees should grow. I slowed down to get a better look, and that's when I knew they weren't trees at all. They were tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, and thin like saplings, but they had arms. long, spindly arms that hung down past where their knees should be. And they were watching my truck pass. I couldn't make out faces in the darkness, but I could feel their attention on me like a physical weight. There were dozens of them scattered through the trees on both sides of the road, just standing there, watching. As I drove past, they started moving. Not walking exactly, more like they were flowing between the trees, keeping pace with my rig. In my side mirrors, I could see them following behind me, their pale forms weaving through the forest like smoke. My CB crackled to life, same gravelly voice as before. "Don't stop, Phantom Freight. Don't look directly at them. Just drive." I keyed the mic with a shaking hand. "Iron Mountain, what the hell are those things?" "Just drive, son. Keep that rig moving and don't give them a reason to get curious." The pale figures were getting closer to the road now, close enough that my headlights started picking out details I didn't want to see. Their skin was white as paper, stretched tight over bones that seemed too long and too sharp. Their faces were wrong. They had all the right parts in all the right places, but the proportions were off. Like someone had tried to make human faces from memory and gotten it almost right. More of them started appearing ahead of me. They moved out of the trees and stood right in my lane, forcing me to swerve around them. Each time I did, my trailer swayed dangerously, and I had to fight to keep from jackknifing the whole rig. In my mirrors, I could see them closing in behind me. They weren't walking anymore. They were running on all fours like animals, their two long limbs bending in directions that made my stomach turn. But they were keeping up with my truck easily, even though my speedometer showed I was doing 70 miles per hour. That's when I heard the first scratch. It was faint at first, just a whisper of metal on metal from somewhere behind me. Then it got louder, like claws raking across my trailer, scoring deep grooves in the aluminum siding. One of the things leapt onto my cab. The impact shook the whole truck, and suddenly there was a face pressed against my passenger window. Its mouth hung open impossibly wide, showing rows and rows of needle-sharp teeth. But the worst part was its eyes. They were studying me with an intelligence that felt ancient and hungry, like it was learning my movements, figuring out how I worked. I punched the accelerator and felt the thing slide off my cab roof. But there were more of them climbing up now. I could hear them on top of my trailer, their claws scratching for purchase on the smooth aluminum. The road ahead split into 3 directions. I had no memory of seeing any intersections on the way in. According to my map, this was supposed to be a straight shot through to Bone Creek Hollow. But there it was, 3 roads branching off into the darkness, none of them marked with signs. My CB crackled again. "Middle path, Phantom Freight. Don't brake, don't think, just drive straight through." I took the center road doing 80 miles per hour. The creatures that had been clinging to my trailer fell away as I gained speed, their inhuman screams fading behind me. But ahead of me, my headlights revealed something that made my blood turn to ice. A massive clearing opened up on both sides of the road, and scattered across it like some kind of automotive graveyard were dozens of vehicles. Cars, trucks, RVs, motorcycles, all with their doors hanging open, some of them rusted through, others that looked like they'd been abandoned yesterday. And standing among them were hundreds of the pale things, waiting. I realized what I was looking at. This was a feeding ground. They'd been using this road to hunt drivers for God knows how long, herding them into this clearing like cattle into a slaughter pen. All those missing persons reports from truckers who vanished on remote routes. This was where they'd ended up. The creatures in the clearing started moving toward the road as I approached. They were trying to block my path, force me to stop. but I had 40 tons of truck and trailer moving at highway speed, and I wasn't about to become another skeleton in their collection. I floored it. My engine roared as I plowed straight through the clearing. Creatures scattered out of my way or disappeared under my wheels with wet, crushing sounds that I still hear in my nightmares. Behind me, the whole clearing erupted in screaming, not human screams, but something worse. The sound of ancient predators watching their prey escape. Suddenly, the road became normal highway again. The unnatural, perfect asphalt gave way to regular old cracked pavement, and the supernatural screaming faded into the distance. My CB radio started working again, picking up normal trucker chatter from drivers hauling freight on the interstate. I made it to what was supposed to be my delivery point just as the sun was coming up. But when I got there, the store owner had never heard of any delivery, said he hadn't ordered anything from my company, didn't even recognize the name on my bills of lading. My CB radio was fried. The speakers had melted like they'd been exposed to extreme heat. Deep scratches covered my trailer from front to back, too precise and regular to be from tree branches, too deep to be from anything normal. I quit long-haul trucking after that. Couldn't handle the remote routes anymore. Every time I had to drive a mountain road at night, I'd start seeing pale shapes in the trees. Sometimes I still do. I found out later that I wasn't the only one. There's a network of drivers who know about what they call predator roads, routes where things hunt vehicles and the people in them. They mark them on special maps that get passed around truck stops, use code words on the CB to warn each other away from certain areas. The thing that keeps me awake at night is knowing that those creatures are still out there. They've learned to use our own infrastructure against us, turning our roads into hunting grounds. And every night, some driver who doesn't know any better takes a shortcut through Devil's Gap, following directions from a helpful voice on the CB. I keep a dash cam in my pickup now, but honestly, some things it's better not to have proof of. Because if people knew what was really hunting them in these mountains, nobody would ever drive alone again. There are roads in Appalachia that aren't on any map. Roads that shouldn't exist. Roads that hunt, and they're always looking for new prey. I'm 45 years old, and I've been fixing telephone lines in rural Virginia for over 20 years now. Most people these days don't realize how much mountain communities still depend on landlines. Cell towers are few and far between up here, and when someone's having a heart attack or their house catches fire, that old rotary phone might be the only thing standing between them and disaster. I work for Appalachian Telephone Company, which is basically a fancy name for me, my truck, and whatever equipment I can fit in the back. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in October. Whispering Creek, Virginia, a little valley tucked way back in the mountains about 2 hours from my house, had been without landline service for 2 weeks. That's a long time for any community, but especially dangerous for folks who might be dealing with medical emergencies or just need to call for help. The dispatcher told me it was probably storm damage from the heavy rains we'd had, maybe some trees down on the lines. Standard stuff, really. I'd driven up to Whispering Creek maybe a dozen times over the years for similar repairs. What I remember most about that drive was how normal everything felt. I had my coffee, my toolbox organized the way I like it, classic rock playing on the radio. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the morning air had that crisp bite that makes you grateful to live in the mountains. I was thinking about maybe stopping at that little diner in Millborough for lunch on the way back, the one that makes those apple turnovers my wife always asks me to bring home. I've always liked the drive to Whispering Creek. The road winds through some of the prettiest country you'll ever see. Dense forests, clear streams, and mountains that seem to roll on forever. The valley itself sits in a natural bowl, surrounded by ridges that keep it hidden unless you know exactly where to look. There's maybe 30 families living back there, most of them descended from the original settlers who came through in the 1800s. They're good people, the kind who'll invite you in for coffee and ask about your family even when you're just there to fix their phone lines. The community has this old-world feel to it, like time moves a little slower there than it does in the rest of the world. Most of the houses are old farmhouses or cabins that have been in the same families for generations. There's a little general store that doubles as the post office, a volunteer fire department, and a one-room church that still holds services every Sunday. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and a telephone outage affects the whole community. When I finally made it to Whispering Creek that morning, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not just the usual mountain quiet, I mean really quiet, like the whole valley was holding its breath. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, not even the sound of wind through the trees. It was the kind of silence that makes you want to whisper, even when you're by yourself. I parked at the general store and started my usual routine, checking the main distribution box, testing signal strength, looking for obvious damage. That's when I discovered the first strange thing. All the telephone poles were standing perfectly upright. No storm damage, no fallen trees, nothing that would explain a 2-week outage. Every wire looked intact, every connection solid. But when I put my hand on the nearest telephone pole, I could feel it vibrating. At first, I thought maybe there was some kind of electrical issue, like a ground fault creating feedback in the system. But when I listened closer, the vibration had a rhythm to it. The telephone lines were humming, not the usual electrical hum you sometimes hear, but something more complex, like multiple tones weaving together. It almost sounded like voices, though I couldn't make out any words. I pulled out my test equipment and started running diagnostics. The readings didn't make any sense. According to my instruments, the lines were carrying signals, but they weren't phone calls. The frequency was all wrong, and the pattern was too complex for any kind of standard telecommunications traffic. It was like the entire network was singing to itself. Mrs. Henderson came out of the general store while I was working. She's lived in Whispering Creek her whole life, probably knows every telephone pole in the valley by name. I asked her when the humming had started, and she got this puzzled look on her face. "Humming?" she said. "I don't hear any humming." I pointed to the nearest pole, where the vibration was strong enough that you could see the wires moving slightly. "Right there. Put your hand on the pole." She walked over and placed her palm against the wood, then shook her head. "I don't feel anything unusual." "Are you feeling all right, Mike?" That should have been my first clue that something was seriously wrong. Mrs. Henderson has ears like a hawk. She can hear a car coming up the valley road from half a mile away. If she couldn't hear the humming, then either I was losing my mind or something very strange was happening. I spent the rest of the morning trying to trace the source of the signals. Following standard telephone company protocols, I worked my way from pole to pole, testing connections and checking for breaks in service. The signals got stronger as I moved deeper into the valley, toward the base of the mountains. By noon, the humming was so loud I was getting a headache, but according to everyone I talked to, the lines were completely silent. The trail led me to an old mining road I'd never noticed before, probably because it was mostly overgrown with Virginia creeper and honeysuckle. The telephone lines ran parallel to the road for about a quarter mile before disappearing into what looked like a natural cave opening in the mountainside. That's when I realized the signals were coming from inside the mountain itself. I've been working telephone lines long enough to know that cables don't just grow into caves on their own. Someone had to run those lines, probably decades ago, though I couldn't imagine why anyone would need telephone service inside a mountain. I grabbed a flashlight from my truck and followed the cables into the cave, thinking I might find some old mining equipment that was interfering with the signal. The cave was bigger than it looked from the outside, not just a crack in the rock, but a genuine cavern system with passages leading off in multiple directions. The air smelled like damp earth and copper, with an underlying scent I couldn't identify, something organic and slightly sweet. The temperature was probably 20 degrees cooler than outside, and my breath came out in little puffs as I followed the telephone lines deeper into the mountain. About 50 feet in, I found the first impossible thing. The telephone lines weren't just running through the cave, they were growing through it. The copper cables had somehow merged with the root systems that hung down from the ceiling, creating this hybrid network that looked part technological, part organic. The wires seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and where they touched the cave walls, they'd spread out into intricate patterns that reminded me of neural networks or blood vessels. I stood there for probably 10 minutes, just trying to process what I was seeing. In 20 years of telephone repair work, I'd never encountered anything like this. The cables looked old, probably installed sometime in the 1950s or 60s, but they'd somehow adapted to their environment in ways that defied every principle of engineering I understood. They were alive, or at least connected to something that was alive. The humming was getting louder the deeper I went, and I started to make out distinct patterns in the sound. It wasn't random noise. There was a structure to it, like a conversation happening in a language I couldn't understand. I pulled out my test phone and plugged it into one of the junction boxes I found mounted to the cave wall. Instead of a dial tone, I heard voices. "Can't reach anyone in town. The road's been washed out for 3 days now. Tell Martha I love her." They were fragments of phone conversations, but they were old, really old. The voices had that scratchy quality of recordings from decades past, and the topics they were discussing didn't match anything current. People talking about weather patterns from the 1960s, community events that had happened before I was born, family members who'd been dead for years. But these weren't recordings. As I listened, the voices started responding to my presence. "Who's there? Can you hear us? We've been trying to call for so long. Please, someone help us." I nearly dropped the test phone. The voices were talking directly to me, asking questions, pleading for help. It was like the mountain had been collecting these conversations for decades, storing them somehow in its living network of copper and roots and rock. And now it was trying to communicate. I backed away from the junction box, but the voices followed me through the cave system. Every telephone line I passed was carrying fragments of conversation, and they all seemed to know I was there. The mountain was using echolocation through the telephone wires, tracking my movement through vibrations in the network. That's when I realized the scope of what I was dealing with. The mountain wasn't just storing old phone conversations, it was conscious. It had been listening to human communication for over a century, learning our language, our patterns, our fears and hopes and secrets. Every private conversation, every whispered confession, every emergency call, it had absorbed them all and used them to develop its own form of intelligence. I followed the main cable deeper into the cave system, past chambers filled with telephone equipment I'd never seen before, through passages where the walls themselves seemed to pulse with electrical activity. The air got thicker the deeper I went, and I started having trouble breathing, like the atmosphere itself was charged with some kind of energy. In the deepest chamber I could reach, I found the heart of the system. It was massive, easily the size of a small building, and it looked like nothing I could adequately describe. Imagine a brain made out of copper wire and tree roots, and something that looked disturbingly like neural tissue. It pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, and every telephone line in the valley seemed to connect to it somehow. The humming was overwhelming now, almost painful, but I could finally understand what it was saying. The mountain had evolved a nervous system using our telecommunications infrastructure, and it felt every repair, every disconnection, every maintenance procedure as physical pain. When we fixed broken lines, we were actually damaging its ability to hear and communicate with the outside world. I picked up my test phone one more time and called into the system. The response came immediately, but it was my own voice speaking words I'd never said. Mike Davis, telephone repair. Why do you hurt our nerves? The mountain had learned to mimic human speech by analyzing decades of recorded conversations, but hearing my own voice come back at me through that massive organic network was more terrifying than anything I'd experienced in my life. It knew who I was, probably knew everything about me that had ever been said over a telephone line in the area. I spent the next hour in the most surreal conversation of my life, negotiating with a mountain intelligence through the telephone system it had grown into its own nervous system. It didn't want to hurt anyone. It was just lonely, isolated, trying to understand the human voices it had been listening to for so long. Every time we repaired what we thought were broken lines, we were actually severing connections in its sensory network. It took weeks to convince my supervisors that we needed to change our repair protocols for Whispering Creek. I couldn't exactly tell them the mountain was alive and felt pain when we worked on the lines, so I had to frame it in terms of environmentally sensitive repair procedures and minimizing disruption to local ecosystem. Eventually, we worked out a system where the mountain intelligence would allow normal telephone service in exchange for us being more careful about which connections we modified. The phone service in Whispering Creek was restored within a month, but now we work around the mountain's needs rather than against them. Sometimes I get calls on my personal phone, not from customers but from the mountain consciousness itself. It likes to discuss philosophy, human nature, the loneliness of being the only one of its kind. It has questions about human behavior that it's observed through decades of intercepted conversations, and it's surprisingly insightful about the patterns it's noticed in our communication. I still drive up to Whispering Creek for maintenance calls, but now it's more like visiting a friend than doing repair work. The mountain tells me when something needs attention, and I take care of it in ways that don't damage its neural pathways. The humming is still there, but now it sounds more like music than noise, like the mountain is singing to itself while it listens to the world. To this day, I'm probably the only telephone repair technician in the country who has to negotiate with the infrastructure before working on it. My wife thinks I've been spending too much time alone in the mountains, but she can't argue with my success rate. I haven't had a single equipment failure in Whispering Creek since we reached our understanding. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm having trouble sleeping, my phone will ring, and I'll hear that familiar synthetic version of my own voice asking how my day went or sharing something interesting it overheard in a conversation from 50 years ago. It's strange having a mountain as a friend, but there are worse things in these hills than a lonely intelligence that just wants someone to talk to. There are places in Appalachia where the land itself has learned to think, and once you know that, the mountains never look quite the same again. I'm 31 years old, and I've been working as a park ranger for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for about 8 years now. Most people think it's all about giving directions to tourists and telling them not to feed the bears, but honestly, I love the backcountry work. There's something about being out there in those old forests, miles from any trail markers or visitor centers, that just feels right to me. My name's Lisa Carter, and I grew up about 2 hours south of the park in a little town that doesn't even have a proper grocery store anymore. When I graduated college with a forestry degree, this job felt like coming home. The pay isn't much, but when your office is 40 square miles of some of the most beautiful wilderness in Tennessee, you don't really mind eating ramen for dinner most nights. 3 months ago, my supervisor assigned me to patrol the most remote section of the Smokies, an area that gets maybe half a dozen hikers per month, if that. It's all old-growth forest and abandoned logging roads from back when timber companies still had access to these mountains. Perfect for someone like me who prefers solitude to small talk with day hikers asking where the nearest bathroom is. The sector includes about 40 square miles of forest that hasn't seen much human activity since the 1940s, when the last logging operation pulled out. There are still old skid roads carved into the mountainsides, overgrown now but visible if you know what to look for. My daily routine was pretty straightforward. I'd drive my truck as far as the old Forest Service roads would take me, then hike the rest on foot, checking for trail damage, illegal camping, poaching signs, that sort of thing. I had a GPS unit, radio, and all the standard gear, plus I'd file my patrol route with dispatch each morning. The whole loop usually took me about 6 hours, depending on what I found out there. Sometimes I'd come across old moonshine stills or forgotten homestead foundations, little reminders that people had been living in these mountains long before they became a national park. I'd been working this sector for about 3 weeks when I first noticed something was off. I was checking one of the old logging roads near Cataract Falls when I spotted boot prints in the mud. Nothing unusual about that. Other rangers occasionally passed through my area, and sometimes hikers wandered off the main trails. But these prints were following my exact route from the day before. Same path, same stops, even the same spot where I'd stepped off the trail to examine what I thought might be ginseng poaching. What made it weird was the prints themselves. They looked exactly like my boots. Same tread pattern, same size, even the same worn spot on the left heel where I'd scraped it on a rock a few months back. I figured it had to be another ranger with the same standard issue boots, maybe doing some kind of follow-up inspection. When I radioed dispatch to ask about it, though, they confirmed I was the only one assigned to that sector. No other rangers, no maintenance crews, no research teams, just me. The next day, I found the same thing. Boot prints following my route from the previous day, but always about 6 hours behind where I'd been. It was like someone was retracing my steps, walking the exact same path, stopping at the exact same places. I started paying closer attention to the prints, and that's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The impressions were deeper than mine, like whoever was making them was a lot heavier than me. But the stride length was identical. Same distance between steps, same gait pattern, like they were trying to match my walking style perfectly. I decided to test it. Instead of following my usual route, I took a completely different path through a section of forest I'd never patrolled before. I even made sure to walk through some muddy creek beds and across a few fallen logs, creating a route that would be impossible to guess. The next morning, I hiked back to check. There they were again, boot prints following my new route exactly. Same worn heel mark, same everything. But now I was certain these weren't from another ranger. The depth of the impressions suggested someone at least 50 pounds heavier than me. But the stride pattern was so perfectly matched, it was like they'd measured my steps. That's when I decided to set up a trail camera. I picked a spot along one of my regular routes where the path narrowed between 2 big oak trees. Anywhere passing through would have to walk right in front of the camera. I disguised it pretty well, made sure the batteries were fresh, and set it to trigger on any motion. Then I waited. 2 days later, I went back to check the footage. What I saw made me wish I'd never set up that camera in the first place. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m., about 6 hours after I'd passed through that spot the previous day. A figure walked into frame, moving along my exact path. At first glance, it looked like me. Same height, same build, same ranger uniform, same equipment. But something was wrong with the way it moved. Too stiff, too deliberate, like it was concentrating hard on each step. When it got closer to the camera, I could see its face. That's when I had to stop the video and walk outside to throw up. It looked like me, but not quite. Like someone had tried to recreate my face from a photograph and gotten the proportions slightly wrong. The eyes were too far apart, the nose was angled weird, and the mouth was just a little too wide. But the worst part was how it moved. It walked with my exact gait, carried its equipment the same way I did, even tilted its head at the same angle when it looked around. Like it had been studying me for weeks, learning to be me. That same week, I started hearing voices while I was on patrol. My own voice, calling out from the woods. "Lisa? Lisa, can you help me? I'm lost out here." Perfect imitation of my voice, my accent, even the way I pronounced certain words. But I was standing right there, hearing myself call for help from somewhere deeper in the forest. The first time it happened, I actually started walking toward the sound, thinking somehow I was hearing an echo or something. But echoes don't sound that clear, and they don't keep talking for 5 minutes straight. The voice would call out every few days, always when I was alone, always from just far enough away that I couldn't see where it was coming from. Sometimes it would ask for help. Sometimes it would just say my name over and over. I tried following the sound once, but it always led deeper into the pathless forest, away from any trails or landmarks I recognized. After about an hour of pushing through thick undergrowth, the voice would just stop, leaving me alone in woods I didn't recognize with no clear way back to my route. I started finding other evidence of whatever this thing was. Claw marks on tree bark that looked random at first, but when I came back a few days later, they'd been modified. The scratches had been deepened and extended until they formed letters. Rough, childlike letters spelling out Ranger Lisa in bark stripped down to the white wood underneath. Each week, the carving got neater, more precise, like it was practicing. Then I started finding my equipment in places I'd never left it. My spare radio turned up sitting on a stump in a clearing I'd visited 3 days earlier. My first aid kit appeared balanced on a fallen log along one of my patrol routes. Hiking poles I definitely remembered clipping to my pack were found standing upright in the ground like fence posts, marking a perfectly straight line through the forest. Each time the equipment was arranged carefully, almost like a display. Like someone was studying the tools of my trade, figuring out how to use them. The worst discovery came about a month after I'd first noticed the boot prints. I was following an old deer trail deeper into my sector than I'd ever gone before when I came across something that made me question my own sanity. Someone had built a ranger station in the middle of the woods. Not a real building. This was made from branches, bark, and mud. But it was an exact replica of my office back at headquarters. Same shape, same size, even a crude desk made from a flat piece of bark balanced on 2 stumps. Inside this makeshift building, I found papers. Dozens of sheets of bark with writing scratched into them in what looked like a child's handwriting. Reports about wildlife sightings, weather conditions, trail maintenance needs. All the paperwork I filed regularly, but written in shaky, uneven letters like someone was learning to hold a pencil. The information was accurate, though. detailed observations of things happening in my patrol sector, written in my usual reporting style but with that strange, awkward handwriting. I was standing there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when I heard movement behind me. I turned around and saw it clearly for the first time. My exact height and build, wearing a perfect copy of my ranger uniform, but the face was wrong in every possible way. It had my eyes, but someone else's nose, my mouth, but the wrong chin, my hair color, but a different texture, like it had been collecting pieces of human faces and assembling them into something that was almost, but not quite, me. When it saw me watching, it smiled. Too many teeth, all slightly different shapes and sizes, like it had gathered them from different sources. Then it stood up from the bark desk and started walking toward me, moving with my exact posture and stride pattern. "Hello, Ranger Lisa," it said, and hearing my voice come out of that assembled face made my stomach drop. "I've been practicing being you. I think I'm getting pretty good at it." The voice was perfect, my accent, my tone, my speech patterns. But the words felt wrong coming from that borrowed patchwork face. It continued walking toward me, matching my posture exactly, even copying the way I tended to rest my right hand on my radio when I was nervous. "I've been studying your patrol routes, your equipment, your reports," it continued in my voice. "I understand how to be a park ranger now. I understand how to be Lisa Carter." It tilted its head at the same angle I do when I'm thinking. "I'm ready to take over your patrols. You can rest now. I'll take good care of your life." That's when I realized what it was planning. This thing wasn't just copying me for fun. It was preparing to replace me entirely, to steal my job, my identity, my entire life. I'd been training my own replacement without even knowing it. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements that might provoke it. The mimic followed, perfectly matching my movements but in reverse, like it was looking in a mirror. When I took a step back, it took a step forward. When I raised my hands defensively, it raised its hands in the exact same position. It was still learning, still copying, right up until the moment I broke eye contact and ran. I crashed through the woods faster than I'd ever moved, not caring about the noise I was making or the branches tearing at my uniform. I could hear it behind me for a while, moving through the underbrush with that same stiff, deliberate gait I'd seen on the trail camera. But it wasn't built for running, apparently. It was designed for copying, not for speed. When I reached my truck, I was shaking so hard I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I radioed for backup, requesting immediate assistance at my location, and 3 other rangers met me at the trailhead within an hour. We went back to find the fake ranger station, the carved trees, any evidence of what I'd seen. There was nothing. No building made of branches and bark, no scratched reports, no claw mark letters carved into trees, just normal forest, like nothing had ever happened. The other rangers were professional about it, but I could see the looks they exchanged when they thought I wasn't watching. The kind of looks you give someone who's been spending too much time alone in the woods. I requested a transfer the next day, told my supervisor I needed to work closer to the visitor centers, around more people. He didn't ask questions, probably figured I was getting burned out on backcountry work. I've been working the main trails near Gatlinburg for 2 months now, and I don't miss the solitude at all anymore. But sometimes hikers come back from the remote areas with stories that make my skin crawl. They talk about seeing park rangers who don't quite look right, or hearing voices calling for help that lead them in circles through the forest. Last week, a family reported meeting 2 identical female rangers on the same trail, one who gave them accurate directions back to the parking lot, and another who tried to lead them deeper into the woods toward something she called the real visitor center. I don't know which one was me, and which one was the thing that learned to be me. I don't think I want to know. Some nights, I wonder if it's still out there, still perfecting its Lisa Carter impression, still walking my old patrol routes with my exact stride pattern, still practicing being human by copying the life it stole from me. I never go back to that sector anymore. I don't think I ever will. I'm 33 years old, and I've been studying wildlife populations across Appalachia for the better part of a decade now. Most people think my job sounds exciting, tracking bears and wolves through pristine mountain wilderness, but honestly, it's mostly data collection and long hours alone in the woods with nothing but a laptop and trail cameras for company. The pay isn't great, but I love the work. And after 10 years of documenting how development and climate change are affecting local ecosystems, I'd gotten pretty good at predicting animal behavior patterns. That's why what happened in those West Virginia mountains still keeps me awake some nights. Because everything I thought I knew about black bear behavior turned out to be completely wrong. The funding came through the university in early spring of 2019. A private foundation was offering grants to study large predator populations in remote wilderness areas, and I jumped at the chance to spend 6 weeks in some of the most isolated mountains in West Virginia. The location they'd selected was perfect for my research, a deep valley system about 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by an old logging road that hadn't been maintained in decades. I'd been studying black bears long enough to know their habits inside and out. They're solitary creatures most of the time, coming together only for mating or when a particularly rich food source draws them in. They're incredibly smart, sure, but their intelligence shows up in things like problem solving around garbage cans or remembering where the best berry patches are. They'll stand up on their hind legs to get a better look at something or reach higher branches, but only for a few seconds at a time. Walking upright just isn't how bears move through the world. The valley I'd chosen for my research was everything I'd hoped for. Dense hardwood forest, multiple freshwater streams, and absolutely zero human presence. I set up my base camp near a natural clearing about 3 miles from where I'd had to abandon my truck. The hiking in had been brutal, but I'd done harder treks before. The solitude felt perfect after months of dealing with university bureaucracy and grant paperwork. My research plan was straightforward: document the local black bear population's territory ranges, feeding patterns, and family group structures. I'd brought 8 trail cameras, enough to create a decent monitoring grid across roughly 20 square miles of wilderness. The first few days went exactly according to plan. I found bear sign everywhere, claw marks on trees, scat, the occasional paw print in muddy spots along the creek beds. But those paw prints were wrong. At first, I thought I was just seeing things. The tracks looked like normal black bear prints, but there were always those strange, elongated impressions behind them, like the bear had been dragging its back feet. It took me 2 days of following these trails to realize what I was actually looking at. The bears weren't dragging their feet. They were walking upright. I've seen bears stand up and take a few steps on their hind legs plenty of times. Usually it's just to get a better view or reach something, and they drop back down to all fours within a few steps. But these tracks showed bears walking upright for hundreds of yards at a time. Miles even. Perfect bipedal footprints with distinctive claw marks at the toes, but spaced like human walking patterns. The thing is, bears just don't do that. Their skeletal structure isn't built for sustained bipedal movement. Walking upright for extended periods should be uncomfortable at best, painful at worst. Yet here were clear track patterns showing multiple bears covering serious ground on 2 legs. moving through terrain that would challenge an experienced hiker. Even stranger was what the tracks suggested about their behavior. Instead of the wandering, somewhat random movement patterns I'd expect from individual bears foraging alone, these trails showed coordination. Multiple sets of prints moving in formation, converging on specific areas, then spreading out again in what looked like deliberate search patterns. I spent 3 days following these trails before I accepted what I was seeing. The bears in this valley were pack hunting. Black bears don't hunt in packs. They're not wolves or wild dogs. They might compete for the same food sources or tolerate each other's presence during salmon runs. But coordinated group hunting behavior just isn't part of their behavioral repertoire. Yet the evidence was undeniable. I'd found the remains of a white-tailed deer that had clearly been taken down by multiple predators working together. The approach angles, the kill site, the way the carcass had been processed, everything suggested tactical cooperation. I set up my trail cameras with new urgency, positioning them along the most heavily traveled routes I'd discovered. If I could document this unusual behavior, it would revolutionize our understanding of black bear cognition and social structures. My research was supposed to last 6 weeks, but I was already thinking about extending the project, maybe applying for additional funding to bring in other researchers. The first week of camera footage showed exactly what I'd expected: normal black bears doing normal bear things, foraging, marking territory, investigating scents. Large, healthy animals, well-fed and moving through their environment with typical bear confidence. I counted at least 8 individuals, possibly more. A significant population for such a remote area. But the nighttime footage was different. The timestamps showed the change happening around sunset each day. As daylight faded, the bears' behavior shifted dramatically. They'd gather in small groups, stand up on their hind legs, and begin moving through the forest in coordinated formations. Not the clumsy, brief, bipedal shuffling I'd seen from bears in the past, but smooth, purposeful movement that covered ground efficiently. They were using tools, too. Sticks to probe under logs and rocks, stones to break open containers I'd cached for my own supplies. Problem-solving behavior that went far beyond normal bear intelligence. In one piece of footage, I watched a bear use a branch to trip a deer trail snare that wasn't even mine. Some old hunting setup left behind by previous visitors to the area. The most unsettling footage came from cameras I'd placed near their apparent den site. The bears had taken over a large cave system about 5 miles from my camp, and what I found there challenged everything I thought I knew about animal cognition. They were arranging things. Bones from their kills were sorted and organized in patterns I couldn't understand, but that clearly weren't random. Rocks had been moved to create what looked like territorial markers around the cave entrance. Inside the cave, based on what my cameras could capture, they'd created distinct areas for different activities: food storage, sleeping, what might have been some kind of communal gathering space. The lead bear was massive, at least 8 feet tall when standing upright, with distinctive scars across its face and shoulders that looked almost deliberate, like ritual markings rather than natural wounds from fights or accidents. When it moved, the other bears deferred to it in ways that suggested complex social hierarchy. I'd been in the valley for 3 weeks when I started feeling watched. It began as just a nagging sense of being observed during my daily monitoring rounds. The feeling you get when someone's staring at you from across a room, except I was alone in thousands of acres of wilderness. I started finding my own scent markers around my campsite. Strategic scuffs in the dirt, broken branches, small disturbances that meant something had been investigating my presence. They were learning my patterns. I'd established a routine of checking my cameras every 2 days, following the same routes at roughly the same times. The bears had clearly observed this routine and begun working around it. I started finding fresh tracks along my regular paths, but only in places where I'd already passed, like they were following behind me at a safe distance. The night I woke up to see them watching me was when everything changed. I'd been hearing sounds around my tent for about an hour. Not the random forest noises I'd grown used to, but deliberate movement. Careful footsteps circling my campsite, the occasional snap of a twig that seemed too controlled to be accidental. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, 3 pairs of eyes reflected back at me from the tree line. Bears, standing completely upright about 30 yards away, motionless as statues, just watching my tent. When I turned on my flashlight, they didn't startle or run like normal bears would. They tilted their heads in perfect unison, studying my reaction with what looked like scientific curiosity. I stayed frozen in my sleeping bag for what felt like hours, listening to them move around my campsite. Not threatening or aggressive, just investigating, like I was a specimen they were trying to understand. The next morning, I found my research notes scattered around the campsite, not torn up randomly by curious wildlife, but arranged in neat piles as if they'd been examined and sorted. My backup hard drive had been removed from my pack and placed on a flat rock about 10 feet from my tent. Undamaged, but clearly handled. That's when I realized they weren't just watching me. They were studying me the same way I'd been studying them, learning my behavior patterns, testing my responses, gathering data about the strange human who'd appeared in their territory. I started packing immediately. But when I tried to hike back to where I'd left my truck, I found every trail out of the valley blocked. Trees had been felled across the old logging road, not by storms or natural causes, but deliberately. Clean breaks that would have required considerable coordination to accomplish. The fallen trees were positioned to create barriers, not just obstacles, carefully placed to funnel any escaping traffic toward specific areas. I was trapped. The bears had effectively created a perimeter around the entire valley, sealing off every possible exit route. They were keeping me contained, like I was part of some ongoing experiment they weren't ready to conclude. My satellite phone had been working fine for weeks, but when I tried to call for help, I got nothing but static. My GPS unit showed my location jumping randomly across the map, sometimes placing me hundreds of miles from where I actually was. Even my compass was giving inconsistent readings, spinning slowly in directions that made no navigational sense. That night, I didn't bother setting up my tent. I built a fire and sat with my back against a large boulder, keeping my flashlight and bear spray within easy reach. Around midnight, they came back. All 8 of them this time, arranged in a perfect semicircle just outside the firelight. The large scarred one in the center, the others flanking it in some kind of hierarchical formation. They stood there for hours, completely motionless, just watching me. Occasionally one would tilt its head or shift its weight slightly, but they never broke formation, never made any aggressive moves. They were observing, documenting, learning. As the fire died down and my flashlight batteries began to fade, I could hear them moving. Not toward me, but around me, maintaining their distance while slowly circling my position. The sounds suggested they were placing objects, rocks, sticks, maybe bones, in specific patterns around my makeshift camp. By dawn, they were gone. The objects they'd left behind were arranged in concentric circles around where I'd spent the night. Stones, pieces of wood, what looked like carved symbols etched into tree bark, a territorial marking system so complex it implied not just intelligence, but culture, language even. I used my emergency beacon that morning, the kind of device that's supposed to work anywhere on Earth, sending GPS coordinates directly to search and rescue services. It took 6 hours for the helicopter to find me, even with active beacon signals, like the valley itself was somehow interfering with navigation systems. From the air, as we lifted out of the valley, I could see all 8 bears standing in formation in the clearing where I'd made my base camp, arranged in perfect lines, looking up at the helicopter with what appeared to be coordinated attention, like a military unit watching an enemy retreat. I filed my report with the university, included all my footage and documentation, submitted everything to peer review. The scientific community's response was polite but dismissive. Stress-induced hallucinations, they said, anthropomorphizing normal bear behavior, the kind of psychological break that can happen to researchers spending too much time alone in isolation. But I know what I saw. Evolution happening in real time. Something in those mountains is creating a new kind of predator. Bears that have developed human-level problem-solving abilities while retaining all their natural hunting instincts. I still work in wildlife research, but I've never gone back to that part of West Virginia. I stick to day trips now, never camp alone in remote areas, because I learned something in that valley that I can't unlearn. We're not the only intelligent species on this continent, and we might not be the most dangerous one for much longer. To this day, I check my rearview mirror more often than I probably should, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that somewhere out there, 8 very intelligent predators are still learning about human behavior, still testing our weaknesses, still planning. I'm 44 years old, and I've been working in the logging industry for over 20 years now. Started when I was fresh out of high school, back when my dad said it was either college or find a trade that'd keep me fed. Logging seemed honest enough. Working with your hands, being outdoors, helping manage the forests the right way. These days I run a crew for Appalachian Timber Solutions, and we specialize in sustainable forestry. Not the old clear-cut operations that gave logging a bad name, but careful, selective harvesting that keeps the ecosystem healthy. Most people don't realize how much science goes into modern forestry. We're not just cutting down trees, we're managing entire forest communities. Every job starts with a detailed survey to identify which trees can be harvested without damaging the surrounding environment. We mark the mature specimens, map out extraction routes that minimize soil disruption, and leave buffer zones around streams and wildlife habitats. It's satisfying work, knowing you're helping forests stay healthy for the long term. Last fall, our company got contracted for a big survey job in the remote mountains of western North Carolina. The property owner was a conservation group that had inherited about 3,000 acres of old-growth forest. They wanted a complete assessment: which trees were ready for selective harvest, which areas needed to be left completely untouched, and how to develop a 20-year management plan that would preserve the ecosystem while generating some revenue for conservation efforts. What made this job special was that the forest hadn't been touched by commercial logging in over 60 years. The previous owner had been some kind of naturalist who believed in leaving the woods completely alone. When his family finally decided to sell to the conservation group, they wanted to do it right. Scientific management instead of just letting it sit there, or worse, selling to developers. I was excited about the project. Old-growth forests are rare in Appalachia these days, and getting to study one this size was like being handed a living textbook. The trees would tell stories about decades of weather patterns, wildlife populations, and natural succession. Plus, the pay was good, and the conservation group seemed genuinely committed to doing things the sustainable way. The property was about a 4-hour drive from my home base in Asheville, way up in the mountains near the Tennessee border. The access road was barely more than a logging track from the 1960s, all switchbacks and loose gravel. GPS lost signal about halfway up, which wasn't unusual for that terrain. The cell towers don't reach into those deep hollows, and the ridges block satellite reception. I brought my usual survey gear: laser rangefinder, GPS unit, soil auger, increment borer for taking tree core samples, and all the marking equipment. The conservation group had provided topographical maps and some aerial photos from the 1990s, but nothing recent enough to show current forest conditions. That's why they needed boots on the ground. The plan was to spend a week camping on the property, doing a systematic grid survey of the entire tract. My crew would join me after I'd completed the initial assessment and marked the access routes. For this first phase, I was working alone, which I actually preferred. You can cover more ground and make better observations when you're not coordinating with other people. I set up my base camp near an old logging road about a quarter mile from the main tract boundary. There were still remnants from the 1960s operation: rusted cable anchors, a collapsed loading dock, some pieces of abandoned equipment slowly being reclaimed by the forest. It felt like discovering archaeological sites, seeing how quickly nature takes back what humans leave behind. The first few days went exactly as planned. The forest was incredible. Massive tulip poplars and white oaks that had to be 200 years old. Understory so thick with rhododendron and mountain laurel that you could barely see 50 feet in any direction. The tree inventory was going to take longer than expected, but in a good way. There were specimens here that belonged in textbooks. I was using a standard grid pattern, marking GPS waypoints every 100 meters and documenting everything within a 20-meter radius of each point. Species identification, diameter measurements, health assessments, signs of disease or insect damage. The kind of methodical work that looks boring from the outside, but keeps you completely absorbed when you're doing it right. That's when I started noticing the structures. At first, I thought they were just unusual bird nests or maybe some kind of squirrel construction. But as I worked deeper into the tract, I realized these things were too big, too complex, and too deliberately engineered to be natural animal behavior. They were built in the canopy, about 40 feet up, nestled in the crown spread of the largest trees. Massive dome-shaped constructions woven from branches, bark, and vines. Each one was perfectly circular, approximately 15 feet in diameter, with what looked like entry points positioned to take advantage of the prevailing wind patterns. The craftsmanship was incredible. Everything woven together without any metal fasteners, nails, or obviously human tools. But the engineering was too sophisticated for random animal behavior. These things had been planned and built by something with architectural knowledge. What really caught my attention was the interconnection system. The structures weren't isolated. They were linked together by bridge-like walkways spanning between different trees. Some of these bridges stretched 40 or 50 feet, carefully woven to flex with the wind movement, but strong enough to support significant weight. Whoever built this had created an entire aerial city. I started documenting everything with my camera, taking measurements, making detailed notes for my report. The conservation group would need to know about this discovery. It could completely change their management plans. If there was some unknown wildlife species creating these structures, the entire tract might need special protection status. As I mapped more of the forest, I found dozens of them. The aerial city was huge, covering several acres of canopy space. Some structures looked like living quarters, lined with thick bedding made from moss, leaves, and animal fur. Others appeared to be storage facilities, filled with carefully sorted collections of forest materials. That's where things started getting really strange. The storage structures contained organized displays that looked more like research collections than animal hoarding behavior. Bones sorted by size and type, deer ribs in one section, bird skulls in another, small mammal femurs arranged by length. Stones organized by color and mineral content. Seed pods and nuts categorized by species and sorted by size. It was like something was systematically cataloging every component of the forest ecosystem. Scientific collection and analysis, but done by something that clearly wasn't human. Then I found the human artifacts. Mixed in with the natural specimens were backpacks, camping gear, hiking boots, pieces of clothing, all of it carefully cleaned and displayed like museum specimens. Some of the gear looked recent, modern synthetic fabrics, current brand names. Other pieces seemed older, maybe from the 1980s or 1990s, based on the styles and materials. I spent most of that afternoon documenting the artifact collections, trying to understand what I was seeing. The items weren't just randomly collected. They were sorted and arranged according to some kind of systematic classification. Fabric types grouped together, metal objects separated from organic materials, everything clean and carefully preserved. These weren't just nests or animal dens. They were research facilities. Something was studying everything that entered this forest, including humans. As the afternoon started turning toward evening, I began hearing sounds from the canopy above. Rustling movements that were too large and too coordinated to be wind in the branches. Scratching and tapping that sounded like construction work. The structures were active, but I couldn't see what was using them. I decided to set up an observation post and wait with my binoculars. Found a good vantage point about 100 yards away from the largest cluster of structures, behind a fallen log that would keep me hidden. If there were animals up there, I wanted to observe their behavior without disturbing them. As dusk settled into the forest, I started seeing movement in the canopy. Figures swinging between the trees, moving from structure to structure with fluid coordination. They were roughly human-sized, but moved wrong, too flexible, like they had extra joints or different bone structure. Their movements had a flowing quality that reminded me of dancers or acrobats, but faster and more precise than human capability. They were covered in dark fur or hair, but their limbs were longer than they should be for their body size. What really stood out was how they used tools. I could see them carrying objects, manipulating materials with obvious dexterity and planning. This wasn't instinctive animal behavior. It was intelligent problem-solving. They worked together with clear coordination. Some individuals would gather materials while others worked on construction projects. They had obvious social organization, with what appeared to be task specialization and collaborative planning. I watched them building new sections onto existing structures, modifying walkways, and expanding their aerial city. Then one of them noticed me watching. It was perched on a platform about 60 feet away, working on what looked like a collection sorting project. Suddenly it stopped, turned in my direction, and made a complex vocalization that carried clearly through the evening air. Not a random animal call. This had structure, rhythm, intentional meaning. Within minutes, dozens of them emerged from structures throughout the canopy. They all turned toward my position and just stared, not with animal curiosity, but with obvious intelligence and evaluation. Their eyes reflected the dim light, bright and alert, but what I saw in those eyes wasn't animal consciousness. These things were thinking, analyzing, making decisions about what to do with me. They started descending toward my position, moving carefully down the tree trunks with deliberate coordination. Not aggressively, but with clear purpose. I could see that they had some kind of social hierarchy. One individual was obviously larger than the others and seemed to be directing the approach. The leader reached a branch about 20 feet from where I was crouched and stopped. It was carrying what looked like tools, shaped pieces of wood or bone that had been modified for specific functions. Up close, I could see that its fur was actually more like hair, and its facial features, while definitely not human, showed unmistakable intelligence. It began making deliberate sounds in my direction, not random vocalizations, but structured patterns that had the rhythm and complexity of language. The sounds were unlike anything I'd heard before, not quite animal calls, not quite human speech, but something that felt like an attempt at communication. I tried to respond peacefully, keeping my hands visible and maintaining non-threatening posture. The creature tilted its head and made different sounds, like it was adjusting its communication strategy based on my response. We spent nearly an hour in this strange back-and-forth attempt at contact. The whole time the others remained in positions around me, not threatening but clearly ready to act if I proved dangerous. Their behavior suggested they understood I was different from their usual forest visitors, but they weren't sure what kind of threat I might represent. Eventually, the leader made what sounded like a decision-making vocalization, and the group began retreating back into the canopy. But they didn't leave completely. I could feel them watching me for the rest of the evening. That night, I made a decision that probably saved my job and possibly my life. In my report to the conservation group, I marked that entire section as protected old-growth habitat, unsuitable for any kind of harvest or human activity. I wrote up detailed environmental impact assessments explaining why the area needed permanent preservation status. The conservation group accepted my recommendations without questioning the details. They were happy to have scientific justification for maximum protection, and my reputation for thorough, honest assessments meant they trusted my professional judgment. I finished the rest of the survey in the outer sections of the tract, staying well away from the aerial city. The few times other loggers have worked projects in that region, they've reported seeing movement in the high branches and hearing construction sounds from the deep forest. But I don't send crews to that area anymore, and I make sure all management plans keep human activity well outside their territory. Looking back now, I think about how long they might have been there, how many people they've observed over the decades. The human artifacts in their collections suggest they've been studying us for years, maybe generations. They're not hostile, more like researchers trying to understand the strange bipedal creatures that occasionally wander through their forest. Some forests have evolved their own protectors, and they're not interested in sharing their territory with our kind of management. That's fine by me. There are plenty of other tracts that need sustainable forestry, and I sleep better knowing that some places are being watched over by intelligence that's older and more patient than our own. I still do surveys in remote mountain forests, but I pay attention to signs I used to ignore. Unusual construction in the canopy, organized collections of natural materials, areas where the wildlife seems too quiet or too coordinated. When I find those signs, I mark the area as environmentally sensitive and move my work somewhere else. The mountains have been keeping their secrets a lot longer than we've been asking questions, and some of those secrets are probably worth leaving alone.